Synonymous with desert, sand, and heat, the Sahara is one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. Located in North Africa, a half-arid, hostile, infertile, and perhaps irrelevant place, these days it doesn't even have a strategic value in international geopolitics. At first glance, the Sahara is little more than a desert, the largest one on our planet. But of course, this is VisualPolitik. We don't do deserts here. In this video, we will take a look at one of the most forgotten conflicts in international politics. Have you heard of the Western Sahara? Many of you may have, but I'm sure there are others who have no idea what I'm talking about. Western Sahara is located just south of Morocco and is the largest of the 17 non-self-governing territories currently recognized by the United Nations Special Committee for Decolonialization. We're talking about a territory with roughly the same area as the United Kingdom, about 260,000 square kilometers, but with just over 500,000 inhabitants. The population is around 550,000 people, with more or less half of their total being the so-called Sahrawi people. A historically nomadic people, due to the harshness of the environment, they were forced to constantly move from one place to another. Today, for many, it is one of the last great stateless populations to exist in the world. Now, many of you will be asking, why is a place seemingly as insignificant as this so important? Why is there talk of Sahrawi people, and why is only half of the territory's population identified as such? And why on earth is VisualPolitik bothering with such an inhospitable corner of the world? Well, we're going to answer all of those questions, but before we do, let's take a look back at the history.
A transition point.
For centuries, what we know today as the Western Sahara was a transit area between Morocco and Mali, over which the caravans of commerce once circulated. It was the easiest way to avoid the Great Atlas Mountains. This characteristic of being little more than a transit territory, together with its sparse inhabitants and the lack of fixed settlements, made this place completely subject to the control of its powerful neighbors, the Mali Empire and the Kingdom of Morocco, for more than 500 years. However, when these empires went into crisis and trade between the two of them collapsed, no one at all was concerned about the Sahara. The sparse population, its nomadic lifestyle, and the harsh conditions of the environment made establishing a functional government an almost impossible mission, not to mention a huge waste of money. For this reason, the Sahara became a virtually abandoned territory and largely forgotten until one of the former European powers turned its attention back to it. At the beginning of the 18th century, Spain began to take a special interest in this region for two reasons: coastal fishing grounds that could potentially be exploited, and the possibility of establishing Atlantic ports closer to the Americas. This is how a relationship between Spain and the Sahara gradually began to develop, a relationship that was fundamentally based on maritime interests. However, with the expansion of other European empires into Africa, let's just say that Spain didn't want to get left behind, and so in 1884 it claimed a greater part of this territory as its own. And not only that, years later, it formed an agreement with France to formalize the territorial distribution of the Sahara, which allocated an even greater area of influence to Spain. At least on paper, because the truth is that physical occupation did not really happen until well into the 20th century. In fact, not until the 1930s. So this is how what we now know as Western Sahara was shaped as the last Spanish colony. And it was a de facto colony until 1975, when suddenly the scenario completely changed.
Bad execution, bad outcome.
Throughout the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, the Sahara, along with Equatorial Guinea, was something like the last old relic of the Spanish Empire, the last evidence of a dying era. Of course, the reality on the ground was more disappointing than receiving a toy with no batteries. This supposed imperial grandeur was nowhere to be seen, except of course in the nationalist discourses during the Franco regime. The truth is that in the 1970s, the Sahara was nothing more than a kind of pebble in your shoe, a territory that was difficult to maintain and from which Spain obtained practically nothing. However, throughout the dictatorship, the Franco regime held on to hope. They were convinced that sooner or later, enormous hidden riches would appear. In fact, after the discovery of some oil and phosphate deposits in the late 1940s, the Spanish government collaborated with foreign companies to conduct surveys throughout the Sahara. To give you an idea, more than 3 billion pesetas, the equivalent of 700 million euros in today's money, was invested in 1960 and 1961. But now the question is, did Spain hit the jackpot? Well, yes and no. The good news is that at least 27 potential crude oil deposits were discovered. The bad news was that at the same time, oil was discovered in Libya and in the North Sea, two places where it was much easier and much cheaper to extract. So, of course, no companies opted for the Saharan resources. The treasure existed, but it was just very expensive to extract. But hold on a moment, because there was an exception. Spain did not want to leave empty-handed. Let's say that you found a relatively valuable asset, that you discovered a huge deposit of high-quality phosphate that was very cheap to extract. Phosphates are a raw material used intensively in agriculture. So suddenly, and by pure chance, the Sahara landscape went from resembling something prehistoric to the industrial age. Between the late 1960s and early 1970s, Spain launched the Bucram mine, one of the largest phosphate mines on the planet. However, initiating production was not exactly plain sailing. You see, at the same time, the Polisario Front was fighting for Saharan independence against Spain. So what this group did was repeatedly attack the mining facilities and the 100-kilometer belt that allowed the mine to be connected directly to the port, since that was where phosphates were exported from. And so the mine was unsustainable. The mine suffered irregular production until 1973 and was not expected to yield profits until at least 1978. Of course, by that year, Spain was no longer present in the Sahara. In November 1975, a Moroccan civilian convoy known as the Green March, made up of 350,000 people, advanced into occupied Western Sahara. The Moroccan government seized the moment. Francisco Franco was dying, and the Spanish government was thinking more about the transition of power than the constant headaches in the Sahara. For these reasons, Spain literally left its posts in the Sahara as quickly as it could. Morocco gauged the situation well, and the move went perfectly. Not only did it occupy, virtually overnight, all of Western Sahara, but it also took control of the lucrative Bucram mine, a mine that is still operational today and produces around 30 million tons of phosphates every year. In this way, Morocco has become one of the world's largest exporters of this raw material. Each year, this mine generates more than $1 billion for the Moroccan economy. Income which is added to the huge fishing grounds in Sahawi waters and the still untapped oil deposits that, with current technology, could begin to be exploited. In other words, Morocco is not about to let the Sahara escape. That is why independence for this territory seems impossible today. For legal purposes, and in the eyes of the United Nations, Western Sahara does not belong to Morocco, but instead remains a non-decolonized territory, and therefore Spain is still regarded as the administering power.
España apoya los esfuerzos de Naciones Unidas en favor de una solución mutuamente aceptable que prevea la libre determinación del pueblo del Sáhara Occidental en el marco de disposiciones compatibles de la Carta de Naciones Unidas.
Independence? No way. Not even on the agenda.
The Sahara has a strange status, to say the least. It's not independent, but it's not Moroccan, and it's not Spanish either, at least not completely. And if that were not enough, the territory is further divided into two parts. The western part is controlled by Morocco, and a narrow strip to the east, which extends along the border with Mauritania and Algeria, which is controlled by the Polisario Front. And it was this group, the Polisario Front, that established a government in exile in Tindouf, Algeria, in 1976. The government of the self-proclaimed Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. The fact is that today there are just over 50 countries that recognize this government. It is a full member of the African Union, and it aims to achieve international recognition as a fully independent Sahara. However, there is a small problem. Despite trying to achieve this, since the 1980s, Morocco has gradually expanded its control of the territory. As you can see on the map, over the years, as it has expanded and consolidated its dominance, Morocco has built up to 6 dividing walls to prevent the advances of the Polisario Front. As a result, the organization has ended up limiting its control to the most depopulated, infertile, and resource-poor parts of the area. Morocco also knew how to play its cards well on the international scene. You see, the Polisario Front embraced so-called Arab socialism. So the Alawite Kingdom Morocco did not find it difficult during the 1980s and in the midst of the Cold War to obtain the West's support to carry out its plans. However, the UN still regards Western Sahara as a non-self-governing territory pending decolonization, and Spain is still technically the administering power. Why? To find out the answer to that, we have to travel to the Madrid Accord signed between Spain, Morocco, and Mauritania in 1975, just after the Green March. It's in those agreements that we find the root of the problem. In these agreements, Spain transferred administration of Western Sahara to Morocco and Mauritania, although Mauritania seceded from Western Sahara only 4 years later. Hardly surprising because it already had enough problems at home. The point is that the UN does not recognize these Madrid agreements as valid because it is not permissible to transfer control of a colonized territory from one country to another without the voice nor opinion of that territory's own people. That is precisely why the UN Decolonization Committee continues to see Spain as the administering power, and in that role, Spain is charged with carrying out the process of decolonization through a referendum. But of course, as you can imagine, today the role and influence of Spain in the Sahara is weaker than that of Marilyn Manson in the Vatican. Morocco is the occupying power and has full control. And this is where we come to a critical question. Why doesn't the international community simply recognize Morocco as the governing power and leave Spain out of it? Well, basically because this would set a dangerous precedent. Let me explain. On the one hand, recognizing Morocco as an administering power would in effect mean legalizing the occupation of territories by force and without the consent of its inhabitants. On the other hand, Morocco has not shown the slightest intention of carrying out any decolonization process. Its objective seems to be the full annexation of the territory. And no one really cares much about the Sahara because, well, the situation's been bogged down for decades. So Morocco's legitimacy to occupy the territory is not recognized, but nothing is being done to prevent it either. That's the way it stands right now. But at this point, there is a question we simply have to ask. What is life like under the Moroccan occupation? Well, let's just say that things don't look great for the Sahrawi people. On the one hand, Morocco has promoted and allowed the arrival of Moroccan settlers who already make up half the population. On the other hand, the Moroccan monarchy has established firm control with total impunity and has not hesitated for a second to suppress political freedom as well as to curb the slightest freedom of expression. This is what most international human rights organizations are reporting. For example, Amnesty International has repeatedly denounced the systematic violation of the human rights of the Sahrawi people. And in this whole fiasco, Spain, theoretically the administering power, stays silent, and we're not holding our breath that they will say anything in the future either. Everything points to Morocco doing whatever it wants with Western Sahara. And this brings up some questions. Well, what do you think about the conflict? Will we ever see an independent Western Sahara? Should Spain assume its role and fight for a referendum of the Sahrawi people? Well, leave your answer in the comments below, and I really do hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe. Also check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast, and thank you for watching.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.